You're watching The Context. It is time for AI Decoded. Welcome to AI Decoded. The whole purpose of this programme is to lift the lid on artificial intelligence to help you understand what it's all about. And tonight we are going to go under the hood. None of this modern artificial intelligence would be possible without the highly specialised chips. You will have heard of Nvidia, which alongside Apple and Amazon is now one of the biggest companies in the world. You might not have heard of Groq. They are the upstarts in the market, the challenger that so far has raised close to $1 billion in private finance to develop a new and alternative kind of chip to the one Nvidia supplies. AI chips are essential if we are to expand AI at scale, but just as important are the data centres that power and train them. They are the digital factories of the future. They need power and lots of it. And Saudi Arabia, as the world's biggest oil exporter, has spotted an opportunity. Suddenly they are building vast desert data centres, so big they might one day be capable of reaching half the world's population. And this week in Riyadh at the AI Global Summit, they signed a deal with Groq, who will supply the chips for their advanced AI systems. Coming up, we have an exclusive interview with Jonathan Ross, who is the CEO of Groq, who will tell us about that deal that he's secured. And alongside me here in the studio, the brains of the operation, Priya Lakhani. Says that here anyway.
Highly artificially intelligent.
CEO of AI education company Century Tech. It gets bigger and better that every week, I've noticed. Right, listen, before we go any further, I want to play a little film for our viewers because I want them to understand the difference in the AI chips that the big players like Nvidia are manufacturing and this new type that's being developed by Groq. So have a look.
This is what a standard AI chip looks like. It's a GPU. You'll notice the complex crossing lines. This design is responsible for the drastic rise in value for its producers, who made the right bet that GPUs could be the engine for AI. Now this is what a far from standard AI chip looks like. Uniform, clean, and really, really fast. Like 18 times faster than its competition. But is this underdog capable of taking a bite out of the hot AI chip market? Computational needs were changing fast as self-driving, artificial intelligence, and more were being developed at a rapid pace. A new architecture, more specifically specialist chips, would be needed to pull that off. Something tailored deeply for its specific task. This is unlike anything on the market. The millisecond you hit enter, this thing is giving you the entirety of its response. To further put this speed in perspective, Groq chips enable LLMs to write a full book in about 100 seconds.
Goodness me. Before we talk to Jonathan, tell me about the chip ecosystem. What's going on here? What's the context of it?
So the reason why this is really exciting and this new technology that Jonathan and his team have developed is really exciting is because there are very few global players in this ecosystem, right? So you have what we call foundries, which are the big manufacturing facilities that manufacture the chips, right? The biggest foundry for the advanced AI chips is in Taiwan, it's TSMC, right? And then there are a couple of other foundries as well. Then you have what we call fabless companies. The fabless companies are Nvidia, AMD. So they design the chips, but they don't actually manufacture the chips. And then you get companies like Samsung and Intel who essentially have more of the end-to-end sort of ecosystem, right? They design the chips and they manufacture them. And as you'll see, they also start to provide that manufacturing facility to other companies as well. But there's very few players. The market's absolutely massive. But what's interesting, Christian, is Nvidia has about 80%, let's say, of the market, right? They also do data centers and other things, but they are the dominant player in the market. So Groq has come in with this technology. They've done this deal in Saudi Arabia with Aramco. And they are, I'm sure Jonathan's going to tell us, vying for some of that market share. And what's going to be really interesting is, what's his strategy?
Designer and manufacturer?
He'll tell you they're the designers. So, and actually they've picked Samsung, and he'll correct me if I'm wrong, but Samsung as their manufacturer, which I do think is really interesting. Why did they choose Samsung? And what was the reason in the decision-making process? Was there a geopolitical reason as to why they didn't pick a Taiwanese company, TSMC? And we'll talk about the geopolitics of this later, because it's really complex and truly fascinating as well at the same time. But that's the ecosystem. But there's huge amounts of money and investment here. Startups can't just go and build a factory. It costs billions and billions of dollars. TSMC have just opened a factory. Well, they started a factory in Arizona. They haven't completed it, because it costs an enormous amount of money, and they're seeing some issues while they're trying to build that. So it's going to be really interesting to hear from Jonathan, what's his strategy and how's he actually going to try and muscle in on some of that Nvidia market share.
Well, let's bring him in. Jonathan Ross, CEO of Groq. Welcome to the programme. I should say congratulations, because you've just signed this immense deal with Aramco. Tell us what it is.
So we signed a deal to deploy, starting this year, 20,000 of our chips in the kingdom. And next year, we have an MOU to deploy up to 200,000. And Harrison, that Nvidia deployed about 500,000 of their end GPUs last year. Now, of course, this year they've increased it to 2 million, but that still makes us a pretty sizable player.
Right. I'm guessing that the new chips are not in this communication that we have, because your picture is frozen. But we'll press on because we can hear you very well. What is your unique selling point of this chip over the others?
Speed. So the biggest selling point is, you remember dial-up, when you used to have to wait a very long time for your answer to arrive and you would see it show up very slowly? With this chip, you get an answer that's almost instant. It's almost like broadband, and it changes the experience and it makes it much more engaging.
And Jonathan, what's your strategy to carve out a share in this space? Because you've got Nvidia that's going to come out with a Blackwell platform, hopefully in Q4 of this year, and they're claiming 25 times less cost, it's more energy efficient, and it's a lot faster.
Well, the amazing thing is we built this chip on what's considered fairly old technology, 14 nanometer. And you measure it in the size of the things that are on the chip, the transistors and the components. And NVIDIA's latest chips are 4 nanometer. And yet we're actually still faster. Now, you mentioned the Samsung fab that we're going to be building our next generation chip with. We're actually going to be going to 4 nanometer as well. And it's sort of like we get to skip 3 grades in terms of our capabilities when we do that. So we're already the world's fastest. The other thing is we're much less expensive. A modern day GPU has expensive. They also have a lot of other very complex and expensive parts that go in there that they use to connect up that memory. And we don't have any of that. But also, because we're using an older process, 14 nanometer for our current generation, and even by the time our V2 comes around with 4 nanometer, it's going to be pretty widely available technology. It's going to be underutilized. Whereas right now, everyone's trying to use the latest process, and so it's really hard to ramp up the supply.
So just for someone who's not deeply involved in this world as you and Priya are, Priya was explaining to me that these chips are going to be looking primarily at text, but how might they be used in industry in the future? I mean, as we move to facial recognition technology or to driving robot technology, how do you think your second and third versions of this chip might develop?
Actually, our current chip, we just launched what's called multimodal model last week, where it takes both text and images in, and it outputs text about the image. So, for example, you could upload this image and ask, how many lights are in the image or how many lamps, and it will answer that. This is very useful for commerce. For example, you could upload the image of a product and create a description for it. And so that's what some customers of ours are going to be using it for. We also do speech to text. So we're very general. Really, what's different about our chip versus GPUs in terms of what you can use it for is that it's used for something called inference as opposed to training. And the difference between those two when it comes to AI, if you want to become a heart surgeon, you spend many years training. And what GPUs are really good at is training the models. What we're really good at is inference, which is sort of the heart surgeon doing actual heart surgeries, the practice. And you spend a lot of money on the training, but you make your money on the inference. It's also much more cost sensitive because every single time you use one of these AIs, whether it's a chatbot or whether it's something else, you actually are consuming compute. And so where we operate, if you want to think about AI in terms of the way the Industrial Revolution happened or transportation, you could think of the model as the car, but it has to run on oil or petrol. And what we're providing is the compute, which is the new oil. You can have the best AI model in the world, but if you don't have enough compute, you can't run it. And one of the astounding things is in about the last couple of months, about 4 or 5 months, we've gone from fewer than 10 developers to, as of today, we hit 450,000 developers on our platform. It took Nvidia about 7 years to get to 100,000. We got there in 6 weeks. And a large part of that is because what Nvidia did. They created some amazing models that people want to use. But because we run them so much faster and because most of the applications are built to use the AI, there's been incredible demand. And so the reason that we're here in Saudi Arabia is because we need to build out a lot more compute, and they have the financial resources and they have the energy.
And Jonathan, a question about being in Saudi Arabia and this deal, this MOU, I suppose, the Memorandum of Understanding that you've got in Saudi Arabia with Aramco. It's intriguing because I know that the US obviously wants its companies to have a huge addressable market. They want you to do business outside of the US with lots of countries. They want those countries to be cozying up to certainly the US rather than China when it comes to building their AI capabilities. But you know, I'm looking at a parallel example of when Microsoft invested in G42, the UAE company. And Washington was very clear that they needed to stop working with Huawei G42. They needed to sell the stock invested in their company that was invested by Chinese investors. And so you've now done this, got this MOU with Aramco. We know that in Saudi Arabia that they're quite close to the Chinese. You know, they've had deals between the PIF, the Saudi Public Investment Funds. You know, has an interest in Lenovo. You've had an investment from Aramco's Prosperity 7 in an LLM in China. So have US officials been in touch with you? Do you expect them to be in touch with you and Aramco? You know, what do you think about this tension that now exists potentially with this deal that you've struck?
So we've been in contact with the Commerce Department since before this deal happened. And just to be clear, we actually are beyond the MOU stage. So the project is now budgeted for the initial 20,000 chips. The MOUs for the remaining 200,000 or Chinese companies well in advance of the change in posture from the US government. A big part of the reason why was it was very difficult for tech companies to be successful in China. I happened to start the Google TPU, which is the chip that Google uses for AI. And while I was there, I saw that Google, Meta, and many other companies that were very strong companies had a lot of trouble operating in China. What would happen is, as you started to become more successful, things, for example, if you were doing search, your search engine would get slow. And people wouldn't know why. It was the Great Firewall. It would just be slowed down. And it was very hard to compete, not for competitive reasons, but because the government really didn't want you to win. And we, as a small startup, didn't feel that we were going to be in a position to compete in China. So we voluntarily decided not to for purely commercial reasons.
Yeah.
And maybe that's part of why we can do this deal. We're very on side.
Jonathan, we'll have to leave it there. We're up against a break, but thank you very much for coming on and explaining it all to us. Best of luck with the deal that you signed out there. We'll talk about the geopolitics of all this after the break. We're going to speak to Gregory Allen, who used to work in the Joint AI Centre at the US Department of Defence. You're watching AI Decoded. Welcome back. During the Cold War, the United States would only supply supercomputers to the Soviet Union if they were used for weather forecasting and not nuclear simulation, and there were permanent foreign monitors deployed to Russia. All data was open for analysis by US intelligence. Like those supercomputers, the AI models of the future have both civilian and military implications. So what is... Are they subject to the same controls? We've just been talking about that. There is a blanket ban on selling restricted chips to China. What does Washington think about all this? Let's get into it with Gregory Allen. He's a director of the Wadhwani Center for AI and Advanced Technologies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He was formerly with the US Department of Defense. So you'll have heard that last conversation, most of it we got, about whether... you know, if you're doing a deal with the Saudis, there's a backdoor to the Chinese. How will the US government see a deal like that?
Well, I think the first thing to begin understanding is that leaders in the United States, leaders in Saudi Arabia, leaders in China all agree that leadership in artificial intelligence technology is foundational to the future of military and economic power. They are all thinking about how they can increase the competitiveness of their economy, and especially in the case of the United States and China, thinking about how they can gain an edge over one another. For the United States, which has the most advanced chip designing companies like Nvidia, like Groq, based in its homeland, they are seeking to deny China access to the most advanced chips that can be used to train the most advanced AI models. There has been reviews of Chinese military procurement documents, and they are looking for American GPU technology. And that can be used to train hypersonic missiles and run simulations of how they can deliver nuclear weapons, or it can be used for more commercial applications, such as large language models like ChatGPT, which are used by hundreds of millions of people around the world.
And
the
Gregory,
point is that this is a dual-use technology, and the United States government reviews exports of chips such as Groq's around the world under those terms.
Right.
Gregory, and there's reports of some of those chips being smuggled into China, right? And we also had an arrest recently of an ex-Samsung executive.
Yes, understandably, China wants access to these chips, whether or not it's legal to get access to these chips. And so Chinese companies are now engaging smuggling networks to acquire illegally what they can't get legally. Now, that's true of the chip hardware. It is also true of the critical expertise around the semiconductor industry more broadly and AI specifically. In the case of Samsung, these are two former executives accused and at real risk of conviction of transferring critical know-how in advanced semiconductor manufacturing techniques to Chinese companies in violation of intellectual property laws and also economic security laws in South Korea.
It feels like a nuclear arms race.
Yeah.
Well, you know, nuclear technology is very explicitly weapons focused. Really, you have nuclear technology in the energy domain and the weapons domain and a handful of niche medical cases, but it really is first and foremost a military technology. Artificial intelligence is much closer to computing in general, which is, you know, it's very useful for running your Microsoft Word application, but it's also useful for running, you know, military supercomputers for code breaking. That's the challenge here.
I think the reason why I'd agree with Christian that it feels like that is because many years ago, nuclear power and, you know, the ability to have nuclear capabilities really was a way of asserting your dominance on the global stage, right? And it seems that although that's obviously still the case, now AI is very, very much, you know, the other area where they're focused on national security and cyber security. Gregory, before we finish with you, I do want to ask you, because China is at the centre of this. So, you know, what, in your view, is the role of TSMC, which we just talked about earlier, being, you know, the lead provider of these advanced GPUs? They work with Nvidia, they work with AMD, amongst many other customers of theirs. What's their role in terms of China's strategy about whether or not there is a future invasion of Taiwan?
Well, you've heard previously in the earlier conversation that Nvidia has very, very high market share, north of 80% for the AI chips that are used to train these AI models. But where are those chips made? They're made in Taiwan. And Taiwan's market share for logic chips at the most advanced manufacturing nodes is essentially 100%. It's the sole country on Earth that can operate the most advanced semiconductor manufacturing processes. And that is a critical dependence not just of Nvidia, but of the entire global economy. So China, of course, stating that Taiwan is rightfully their territory and stating repeatedly their willingness to use military force if necessary to retake Taiwan, that is an incredible hinge point of global security and the global economy. If a war was to devastate Taiwan's semiconductor industry, which I think is a very real possibility in such a conflict scenario, that would be a global economic catastrophe, and no one would be spared from the consequences of that.
They say it's estimated at about 1 trillion global economy damage per year.
Per year.
Yeah.
Fascinating, isn't it? We talk about what AI can do. We never talk about actually the chips and what is going on around the world to get the best chips and to smuggle them into countries like China. It's extraordinary stuff. Jonathan, thank you very much indeed. That is it for AI Decoded this week. Thanks to Jonathan. Thanks also to Gregory and, of course, to Priya for her expertise as ever. We will do this same time next week. Just a reminder that all the episodes that we've done so far are on the AI Decoded playlist on YouTube. We'll see you next week. Thanks for watching.